The dust hadn't settled yet when Trace Morvan looked up from the fence post he was hammering in. The sharp sound of a horse skidding made him turn just in time to see Creed Voss, someone he knew far too well, yank a woman off the saddle and drop her to the ground like he was tossing a busted sack. She hit the dry earth hard, falling sideways. But she didn't cry out, didn't beg. She just propped herself up on one elbow, pushed off the ground as best she could, and lifted her head. Her arm was streaked with blood and dust, her breathing ragged, but her eyes burned like stones on fire. No fear, just a steady fury and a battered pride. Creed didn't even look at her. "Keep the animal," he spat, like he was talking about a sick mule. "But don't touch her. I'll be back." He rode off at a gallop, kicking up another cloud of dust that the valley wind scattered quick enough. Trace didn't move. The hammer hung from his hand. The whole scene still hung in the air like an unanswered echo. He hadn't asked for this, hadn't sought it out. But something deep inside him knew, with a kind of certainty that leaves no room for argument, that if he turned away now, if he left her lying there, that woman wouldn't live to see another sunrise. Trace's ranch sat far enough from San Remo that the rumors could be heard without having to see them. The valley was his by sundown. Still cattle, fences creaking in the wind, and that patient silence that only solitude could keep. He'd picked that place for a reason. Because men's noise didn't reach out there. Because out there, nobody needed explanations or promises. Just work, routine, and time. In town, folks knew him as a quiet man. Someone who paid on time, didn't pick fights, and left when the job was done. Some called him cold, others proud. But Trace never corrected anyone. He'd learned that misplaced words are like bent nails. They only make things worse. And yet, that woman lying in the dirt, so out of place in his neat world, wasn't just an interruption. She was a shift in the wind. She was Apache. Not just because of the torn clothes or the dusty braid down her back. She was Apache in the way she stayed upright, even with her body shaking. In the way she looked at him, not pleading, but measuring distance. Trace stepped closer, careful to leave her space. He noticed the tremble in her hand, the open wound on her arm, the way she clenched against the pain. That woman had fought, and she hadn't backed down. "You don't belong here," he said finally, his voice low, like the dry air might steal the words away. She stared at him, said nothing. But that silence was an answer all its own. It wasn't fear. It was defiance. The sun was dropping behind the hills. Trace knew how fast the cold set in once the light faded. He knew how brutal the night could be to a worn-out body. He also knew what it might cost him to offer shelter to a wounded Apache woman. For a few seconds, he weighed the risk he could name, against the one he couldn't. "You can stay," he said at last, "until you're strong enough to leave." He didn't touch her, moved slow, like you would around a skittish colt. Got some water, set it down in a tin cup near her, and stepped back. She watched every move. Her eyes never left his hands, his boots, or the way he made sure not to tower over her. When she finally drank, her fingers trembled. The water went down fast, and her body shuddered from the pain. But she didn't ask for help, just waited. "Slow sips," he murmured, more of a warning than a command. Then he turned toward the cabin. "Can you walk?" "I can stand," she said after a beat. That was enough. Inside, the shelter smelled of old wood and a fire long gone out. There was a table, a chair, and a bed against the wall. Nothing inviting. Nothing that said, "Welcome." Trace cleared the table, pulled out a knife, clean rags, and a bottle of spirits. When she saw the blade, her shoulders stiffened. "It's just to cut the fabric," he said, laying the knife flat on the table. She searched his face for something, but found nothing. The wound was deeper than it looked. Trace worked in silence, hands steady, no needless words. Clean. Bandage. Secure. No false tenderness. Just precision. "You fought hard," he murmured, not meaning to say it out loud. She gave a bitter smile. When he finished, he stepped back. "Rest if you can. I'll be outside." "Aren't you afraid I'll leave?" "If you could've, you would've already." She didn't answer. But just as he was stepping through the door, her voice caught him, low and steady. "You're not like him." He stopped. "That's not hard." "That's not what I meant." Trace nodded, like he understood, and walked out. He sat on the porch. His rifle rested beside him. The sky dimmed over the valley. And in that silence that had always served as his shield, he realized something new. Sometimes danger doesn't arrive with gunfire, but with a choice spoken in a quiet voice. By the time dawn pushed the darkness aside with pale light, Trace Morvan was already on his feet. The morning cold still clung to the air, biting the skin like it didn't want to let the night go so easily. He moved along the fence line in silence, like every morning. Checked the east fence, counted the cattle, fixed a hinge that squeaked more than it should have. It was routine. It was what he always did. But that morning, for the first time in a long while, it wasn't all that mattered. When he looked back toward the cabin, for a second he thought maybe she'd be gone. That she'd vanished in the night, like tracks swept clean by the wind. But there stood Rhea Redfeather, leaning gently against the doorframe. The bandage on her arm was still clean and tight. Her face, pale from fatigue, showed no weakness. Her eyes didn't flinch. They met his square on, asking nothing. "You ought to sit down," Trace said, still watching the ground. Mornings hit hard after nights like that. "I've had worse," she answered, her voice low and controlled. Trace nodded. He didn't press. He'd learned that advice, when it's not asked for, feels like judgment. And she didn't need more weight on her back than she already carried. So something settled between them. Not quite companionship. More like coexistence. Two people breathing the same air without stepping on each other's space. Trace left cornbread and jerky on the table, fresh well water in a clay jug. He didn't check to see if she took it. Didn't ask if she slept well. And she didn't offer explanations. In the afternoons, Rhea walked the yard, slow and measured. By the third day, she sat beneath the shade of the barn while he worked, watching his hands with the quiet focus of someone not watching out of curiosity, but out of need. They didn't speak much, but something was threading between the silences. "You live near town," she said one afternoon, from the shadows. "Close enough," he replied, still driving a nail into the board. "But you don't belong to it." He paused for a moment. Thought about it. "I buy what I need there. That's usually enough." She let out a short breath. Not a laugh, but nearly. A man who wants the benefits of people, without the burden of being one of them. Her words were sharp, but not cruel. Just the kind of truth spoken without polish. And Trace didn't take offense. "Sometimes the burden doesn't show," he said, going back to work. "Some folks place it on others before you even know it's there." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "You talk like you've seen it." "I've lived it," he said, and left it at that. The days passed, and with each one, the distance between them shifted its shape. It didn't vanish, but it changed. Trace noticed things, how Rhea guarded her good arm, how she tensed at the distant sound of laughter, how her eyes swept the horizon when the sun began to fall. And she noticed things too, that he never came inside without making some kind of noise, even if he thought she was asleep. That his rifle was always nearby, but never positioned in a threatening way. That when someone passed along the trail, Trace made himself visible, but never stood between her and the way out. "You don't trust easy," she said one afternoon as the sky turned copper. "Trust is expensive," he replied. "I don't buy it often." She studied him for a long while. "And yet, you let me stay." He looked at her then, really looked at her for the first time. "I let you heal." That answer caught her more off guard than anything else. She lowered her gaze, but not from shame. It was because, for once, someone wasn't asking anything of her. Night came slowly. The wind stirred the grasses. The fire in the hearth crackled. And Trace, lying on the same old bed, felt something he hadn't expected. Fear. Not of what she might bring into his life, but of what it might mean. If one day she chose to leave. For a man who had always lived with his back to the world, that was the most dangerous thing of all. The sun was inching toward the horizon when Trace Morvan saw him. A lone rider, silhouetted against the golden light spilling over the valley. The dust his horse kicked up wasn't much. He wasn't in a hurry, but it was enough for a man like Trace to know something was wrong. It wasn't a mailman. It wasn't a neighbor. It was Creed Voss. Rhea sensed it immediately. She was standing by the cabin, folding some dry rags. But the moment she felt the change in Trace's posture, she followed his gaze. Her shift was instant. Shoulders squared, eyes hard as flint, and her hand, almost by instinct, went to the knife she now kept at her belt. "He's back," she said, not raising her voice. "I see him," Trace answered, eyes still locked on the rider. Creed dismounted with that slow, practiced calm that men use when they're used to getting what they want without ever having to ask. His smile was wide, but his eyes measured everything. He looked at Rhea, then at Trace, then at the space between them, and he understood all of it. "Well, well," he said, brushing dust off his sleeve. "Still breathing. That's something. I'll give you that." Trace didn't answer. Creed smiled wider. "I figured you'd do what you do best, Morvan. Keep your head down, stay out of trouble." "She's not yours," Trace said, his voice steady and clear. That sentence sliced the air like a blade. Creed laughed, but it was short, hollow. "Ah, friend, out here everything belongs to someone. The difference is who's got the guts to say it out loud." He took a step toward them. Rhea moved, not to hide, but to shift just slightly behind Trace, choosing her angle, her stance, not like a woman afraid, but like someone who knows exactly who's willing to stand for her, no words needed. That simple gesture, more than any declaration, sealed something inside Trace, something that had already begun to form, but now hardened. "You don't want to step into this, Trace," Creed warned, and his smile had lost all warmth. "You tend cattle. I make deals. We got no reason to cross paths." "You dragged her here," Trace shot back. "You made it my concern." Creed's smile vanished. "Be careful," he said, and for the first time there was a sharp edge in his voice. "You're not built for this kind of loyalty." Trace turned fully, facing him with his whole body, shoulders relaxed, but his gaze hard as iron. "This isn't about loyalty." Creed frowned. "Then what is it?" Trace didn't answer right away. In his mind flashed the days of shared silences, of working without promises, of looking at a wounded woman and seeing more than just a problem. He also thought of that old mistake. The one where he stayed silent when he should have spoken. "It's a line," he said at last, "and you crossed it." Creed's hand went to his gun. Rhea drew a sharp breath. But before anything else could happen, Trace stepped forward, placing himself between Creed and Rhea. It wasn't a dramatic move, nor threatening. It was simple, natural, and yet it changed everything. Creed looked at him in disbelief. "You serious?" "I am. You'd risk your land, your name, for her?" Trace didn't look back. "For me." And that was when Creed understood. He saw it in Trace's eyes. No doubt. No hesitation. He stepped back slowly, raised his hands in a show of surrender, but his eyes were burning inside. "No need for this to turn ugly," he muttered. "I'll go, for now. But you're holding on to something that doesn't belong to you, and sooner or later, that gets paid for." Trace didn't move, didn't raise his rifle, didn't shout. He just stood there, steady as the land beneath his boots, as if his very presence was enough. Creed mounted his horse, never taking his eyes off them. "Enjoy the quiet while it lasts," and he rode off. For a long while, no one spoke, until Rhea said, without looking at him, "You didn't have to do that." Trace took a deep breath. "I know." "Then, why did you?" "Because once, I kept quiet when I should have spoken, and it cost me everything that mattered." She looked at him then, really looked at him, as if finally seeing the man behind all that silence. "He'll come back," she said. "I know." "And still, you chose this." "Yes." Rhea nodded, and her voice, when it came again, was almost a whisper. "Then whatever happens, you won't face it alone." And that night, for the first time, Trace Morvan stayed awake, not out of fear, but to protect. The wind blew soft at dawn. It didn't carry cold or threat, but that certain feeling only known to those who've lived a long time in silence. Something had changed. That morning, Trace Morvan didn't check the fences like he usually did. He sat on the porch step, rifle across his lap, eyes fixed on the place where the sky began to take color. Inside the cabin, Rhea Redfeather hadn't moved. But he knew she was awake. She always was. Since Creed Voss's visit, something had hung in the air, like a taut rope, like a note held in place, still unsure whether it would become music or a gunshot. After a while, she stepped outside, said nothing, sat a few steps from him, legs crossed, hands resting in her lap. The bandage was gone. The wound was still raw, but her movements had grown more sure. The knife still hung at her belt. Not as a threat, but as a promise. No one will drag me again. The sun finally rose, bathing the valley in golden light. Rhea glanced sideways at him. "I thought you'd run," she said. Trace didn't answer right away. "I thought about it, but I'm not fast, and I got nowhere to run." She smiled just slightly, not mocking, but sad. "Most people run even when they got nowhere to go." Silence. "I need to ask," she added. "Why didn't you turn me in? Would have been easier for you." Trace looked at her slowly, as if he didn't want to speak without being sure of the words. "Because I didn't want you to leave thinking all men are like Creed." That answer wasn't heroic. It wasn't romantic. But it was real. And in a land where lies passed as common currency, that counted for more than any promise. Rhea watched him for a long time, as if searching for the crack, as if needing to confirm there was no hidden edge in his words. "My name," she said then, breaking the pause, "is Rhea Redfeather." Trace nodded. He didn't ask where she was from, didn't press for more. "Thank you for telling me, And you? I don't usually give it without reason. And now, I guess you already know. My name's Trace. They both understood that exchange wasn't formality. It was a pact, a quiet, mutual recognition. That afternoon, Rhea began moving around the ranch with ease. She didn't ask for permission. She simply joined in the work like someone who knew the space without needing to claim it. She mended a grain sack that had been left open for days, swept the floor of the cabin, fetched water in a smaller bucket than usual. Trace watched her from a distance. He didn't interfere. But something stirred in his chest. Not from discomfort, but from a sweet, dangerous unease. Help that comes unasked often binds tighter than duty. You don't have to do that, he said once, from the barn. I know, she replied, without stopping her scrubbing. That's why I'm doing it. Trace drove the board in his hands back into place, but his thoughts were no longer on the wood. As the sun dipped low, they sat by the watering trough. The light faded slow and warm. The silence between them was easy, like a blanket. You don't look at me like the others, Rhea said suddenly. Trace stiffened a little. And how's that? Like I owe you something. He looked down at his hands, calloused, cracked, stained by years of labor and dirt. I don't want anything from you. She studied him closely, looking for a lie. Found none. Then, you're stranger than you seem. Trace smiled, just a little. Folks have been telling me that for years. That night, Trace didn't sleep well, not because he was waiting on Creed, not because he feared anything in particular, but because, for the first time, it mattered to him if someone left. And for a man who had built his life on solitude, that was more dangerous than any threat. It was silence that warned him, not the silence of night, nor the kind that drifts through early morning while the wind carries doubt between the fence posts. No, it was the other silence, the kind that settles on your shoulders like a warning, the kind that comes when something approaches, and even the animals go still. Trace Morvan felt it before he saw it. He was at the far end of the pasture, adjusting a loose wire, when his body froze on instinct. He looked up. A lone figure on horseback, outlined against the horizon. Movements slow, deliberate. Too deliberate. Creed Voss was back, and he wasn't bringing words. Trace set his tool against the post. His steps were firm as he walked back toward the corral. The sun was sinking with the cruel slowness of heavy days. Everything was too still. Rhea saw him coming. She stood beside the cabin, folding a blanket. One look was enough to understand that something was moving behind the dust. Her eyes narrowed. Her hand went, without thinking, to her knife, not out of fear, but certainty. Him, she said, her voice just a tight thread. Trace nodded. Yeah. Creed dismounted a few yards from the house, with that practiced calm of a man who wants to look like he owns everything. His boots hit the dry ground. The horse snorted, uneasy. His eyes moved from Rhea to Trace, then to the space between them, and he smiled. Didn't seem likely she'd still be breathing, he said, pretending ease. But I see you've gone soft, Morvan. Softer than I remember. Trace didn't answer. He stood tall. His presence was like a fence no one asked for. But there it was. Steady. Silent. Look, I didn't come to argue, Creed went on, stepping forward. You came to me with respect when you were younger. You know how things work around here. I make decisions. You handle your own business. This doesn't have to get messy. She's not yours, said Trace. Oh, Trace. Creed's smile cracked. Everything out here belongs to someone, and only the ones with the guts to claim it get to keep it. He stepped closer, and then Rhea moved. She didn't run. She didn't hide. She shifted just slightly, stepping behind Trace with the same quiet resolve one takes a breath before crossing a river. It wasn't submission. It was trust. A choice. Trace felt her behind him. No need to look. Her presence at his back didn't weaken him. It defined him. "You don't want this trouble," Creed warned, voice lower now. "You tend cattle. I make deals. Let's not mix paths." "You left her here like she was trash," Trace replied. "You made this my business. You, not her." Creed took a deep breath. "Last chance. Step aside." Trace didn't. "No." Creed's hand lowered slowly toward his revolver. Trace stepped half a pace forward, placing himself fully between Creed and Rhea. The gesture was simple. No threat, no violence. But the message was clear as a knife's edge. "You're not coming through here." "You out of your mind?" Creed barked. "Your land? Your name? For an Apache?" "For me." The world seemed to pause. The crickets went silent. Even the horse stilled. Creed blinked. His face shifted. Rage gave way to calculation, to verdict. "All right," he said at last. "Let's not make a scene out of this. I'll go, for now." He turned, picked up the reins. Before climbing into the saddle, he looked back. "But what you're holding on to doesn't belong to you, and everything gets paid for, sooner or later." Trace said nothing. Creed mounted. He rode away slow, but not like a man retreating, like someone memorizing the trail for his return. Rhea and Trace stood frozen, until he turned his face just slightly. "You didn't have to stand behind me. And you didn't have to stand in front of me." They looked at each other, not with emotion, but with something deeper. A shared conviction. "Why did you do it?" she asked. Trace took his time answering. "Because once, I stayed silent, and I've been paying for it ever since." Rhea lowered her gaze, but it wasn't shame. It was respect. "He'll come back," she said. "Yeah. And even so, you stood your ground." "I did." Rhea nodded, nothing more. Then she said, voice low but firm, "Then whatever happens, you won't face it alone." That night, Trace didn't go to bed. He sat on the porch, rifle across his legs, as if silence itself needed guarding, and what he felt wasn't fear. It was something else entirely. A calm that didn't come from solitude, but from knowing he hadn't backed down. The sky stretched out in ash-gray hues above the valley. The air wasn't cold, but it carried that weight that comes before long nights. In the distance, a lone cow lowed, searching for the herd. Everything looked in place, but on the ground, nothing was truly still. Trace Morvan had done what no sensible rancher would do, stepped into someone else's fight and made it his own. But he no longer lied to himself. It wasn't just about protection. It was something deeper, older, something that still hurt, even if he'd never spoken of it. That night, the fire crackled slow inside the cabin. The warmth wasn't for the body, but for the soul. Rhea Redfeather sat near the wall, back straight, her knife beside her. She wasn't asleep. Trace knew that. He wasn't either. Words hung in the air like embers that refused to die out, until one of them finally spoke. "You could have left me outside." "I could have," Trace said. "But you didn't." "No." "Why?" Trace took a deep breath, took a few seconds before answering. "Because once, I stayed quiet, and for keeping quiet, I lost everything." Rhea didn't ask what he'd lost. She didn't need to. She looked sideways at him. Her eyes weren't demanding answers. They were simply confirming that he had crossed a line inside himself, one most folks don't dare even name. "Creed will come back," she said, without drama. "He's not a man who leaves things unfinished." "I know. And still, you chose this side?" Trace lifted his gaze. His voice was calm, steady. "I did." She nodded slowly. "Then, whatever comes, we'll face it together." The rest of the night was pure watchfulness. Trace didn't sleep. He sat on the step, rifle across his knees, eyes fixed on the horizon as if waiting for an enemy to rise with the moon. But it wasn't Creed who arrived with the dawn. The first thing he noticed was the rustle of grass. Then, voices in a language he didn't speak. Not shouts, low, firm tones. Apache. Rhea rose at once. She was already beside him when they came into view. 3 figures descending the ridge, steady steps, upright posture. Men who knew the land beneath their boots. They carried bows and knives, but not in a threatening way. One of them raised his hand when he saw her. She stepped forward. "Rhodes," she said, her throat tightening, not from fear but from relief. The man hugged her with restrained force. He looked her over quickly, the bandaged arm, the unbroken gaze. "You're alive." "I am." Behind him, a 4th man approached. Taller, broader, older. His very presence said everything. Holt Redfeather, her father. His eyes locked onto Trace, and though he didn't speak at first, his stare held the judgment of a tribal chief. "You gave her shelter," he said at last. Trace didn't flinch, didn't explain himself. "She needed it." Holt studied him for a long moment, then he nodded. It wasn't gratitude. It was recognition. The silence broke suddenly with a sharp, rough noise. From the far side of the hill, something moved clumsily through the brush. A gasp. A crack of branches. Creed Voss stirred in his hiding place. He'd spent the night crouched low, eyes fixed on the ranch, waiting for the perfect moment. But sleep, the cold and fatigue had betrayed him. He jolted upright, saw shadows where no one should have been. His rifle slipped on the rocks and slammed hard. "Shit!" He tried to flee, ran downhill, but the slope was steep, the ground slick. One wrong step, a branch that didn't hold, and then silence. From above, Rhodes barely turned his head. "It's done." Rhea closed her eyes. There was no joy, only release. Trace let out the breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Holt looked at his daughter, then at the ranch. "This land remembers decisions," he said. Trace met his gaze calmly. "So do I." The elder nodded, as if that reply had been expected from the beginning. And so, beneath a sky already pale with morning, the ranch exhaled. Not like before, but with a new weight and a new peace. The morning didn't rush. The sun climbed slow over the valley, like the world itself needed to breathe after carrying so much. Everything felt paused. The cows didn't bellow, the birds flew lower, and even the wind slipped through without a sound. Trace Morvan stood for a long while, watching the riders. Holt Redfeather, his son Rhodes, and a 3rd man he didn't know, make their way down the dusty trail. They didn't look back, and they didn't need to. What they came to do was done. Beside him, Rhea was quiet. But it wasn't the tight silence of days before. It was something lighter, as if, at last, the ground beneath her feet had stopped judging her. They didn't say much that morning. Routine returned like an old friend, checking the well, feeding the hens, scanning the land in case a cow had strayed. Rhea helped, like always, without being asked. But now there was something new in her movements. Certainty. As if, for the first time, she knew the place didn't belong to her. But it respected her. When they finished repairing a stretch of fence that had been crooked for months, they sat beneath the shade of the old cottonwood. No rush. No one expected anything. "Your people," Trace began, breaking the silence. "Did they ask you to come back?" Rhea looked toward the mountains, toward where the trees thickened. "They didn't have to. I already knew I needed to return, at least for a while. Will you?" She didn't answer right away, closed her eyes for a second, as if she needed to hear her own voice first. "Yes, but not to run, and not out of fear. My father needs to see me with his own eyes, and my people. They need to know I didn't break." Trace nodded. He didn't look at her with sadness or surprise, just respect. "Makes sense," he said, "but I don't want to disappear inside someone else's protection," she added quickly, looking him straight in the eyes. "Not again." Trace held her gaze. "I'd never ask you to, and I don't want you staying if it means giving up who you are." A long silence settled between them. One of those silences that doesn't weigh you down, but gives space. That prepares the ground for what's coming. Rhea stood slowly, took a short walk around the yard, her eyes scanning the fence, the corral, the open cabin door. "This place, it didn't trap me," she said. "It just held me up when I needed it most." She stopped beside him. "I'll go back with them. But if I come back—" She paused. "I want this place to be the same." Trace rose to his feet as well. "It will be. I won't turn it into anything else." She looked at him, searching for a promise. She didn't find one. What she found was truth, and that was enough. "Then, that's why I can return." They packed the saddlebag together. Rhea didn't say goodbye with tears, and Trace didn't fumble for words. There were no embraces. There was no need. He handed her the pouch of water and bread. She met his eyes and said just one sentence. "Thank you for not asking anything of me." And she mounted up. Trace didn't follow. He just watched her ride away, her back straight, her pace steady, like someone leaving but not running. The day went on. Trace got to work fixing a section of the barn he'd ignored too long. He worked without stopping, as if keeping his hands busy might quiet the hollow she'd left behind. And when the sun dipped low and the land turned orange, he looked once more toward the trail. He didn't expect to see her yet. But something in his chest was already waiting. The day had started like so many others. Soft light, no hurry, a breeze that didn't sting but carried old dust, birds flying low and quiet. Trace Morvan had been out a while, mending the west fence, the same one Rhea Redfeather had once pointed to with a simple gesture he hadn't forgotten. That fence had been calling for repair for years, and he'd spent just as long avoiding it. He worked without rush, as if with every board he nailed down, he was trying to steady something inside himself too. Behind him, the cabin was empty. Rhea was gone. She hadn't left with tears, and he hadn't asked for promises. He'd simply watched her mount up, tighten the cinch, and give him one last look, steady, wordless. "Thank you," she'd said, "for not turning me into a debt." And then she rode off. Trace had stayed standing there until her figure vanished into dust and sun. The corral was quieter now, but not with peace, with absence. Trace spent the rest of the day fixing fences, hauling wood, tidying things he'd never cared much about before. Not just to stay distracted, but because now they mattered. Now, everything she'd touched, looked at, or pointed to with a nod held new weight. By sundown, he cooked a simple meal. Just enough. Sat on the porch step, like he had so many times, plate on his lap, eyes on the road leading down from the north. The sky turned orange, then pink, and then came the shadow. A figure appeared at the edge of the trail, not galloping, not rushing, with calm, with purpose. Trace set the plate aside. He stood without a word. His hand didn't go for his gun. It went to the brim of his hat, to steady his eyes. It was her. Rhea dismounted when she reached the gate of the corral. She didn't call out, didn't ask permission. She just stood there, waiting. Not to be invited, but to be seen. He walked toward her slowly. The dirt crunched beneath his boots. "You came back," he said. "I said I would," she answered, "and I don't say things lightly." They didn't embrace. They didn't smile. They just looked at each other, the way two people look when explanations are no longer needed. He opened the corral gate. She stepped through, leading her horse by the reins. They didn't speak for a while. Trace went back to his work as if he'd never stopped. Rhea took off her hat, hung it on the hook beside the door, and started helping. With the same ease as before, like she'd never left. She placed boards, held nails, set tools in place, and he didn't ask her anything, because he knew, if she had come back, it was because she had chosen to. When night fell and the stars lit the black sky like holes punched through by fire, Trace stepped out onto the porch. Rhea was already there, sitting on the step, like the spot had been waiting for her. "How was it?" he asked, no urgency in his voice. "Necessary," she replied. "My father looked at me. My people listened, and they understood I'm still standing. And you?" She looked at him calmly. "I needed to see if this place was still the same." Trace raised an eyebrow. "And is it?" Rhea smiled, just a little. A quiet, honest curve. "Yes. You didn't try to make it something else. You didn't fill it up. You didn't hollow it out. You just left it, as it was. Because I knew, if you came back, I'd need to recognize you in the same place that held you up." She nodded. "That's why I could return." That night, they made no plans. They didn't say, tomorrow. They just sat there together, like two pieces that finally understood how to fit without forcing it. The silence was no longer a threat. It was an answer. Routine settled back into ranch life. But it wasn't the same. Rhea Redfeather had returned. Yes, but no one had made her stay. And that changed everything. She moved through the corral like someone who no longer questioned whether she belonged. She didn't ask for permission, didn't explain herself. She simply was. And that presence, solid, quiet, filled the space like a light that doesn't burn, but still illuminates. Trace Morvan didn't ask her anything either. But he watched. He noticed how every morning she paused before the ridge, just before starting the chores, as if greeting the wind. How she touched the ground with her fingertips before planting something. How she left a little extra corn by the chicken coop, for no clear reason, just in case something else might need it. It wasn't superstition. It was memory. One afternoon, after branding the new cattle, they sat under the shade of the cottonwood, the one that had witnessed more unspoken words than any other place in the valley. The sun was sinking slow. The ground was warm, but it no longer burned. "Did you get used to it?" Trace asked, not looking at her directly. Rhea took a second. "No, I adapted, and that's not the same thing." "And is that good or bad?" She smiled without really smiling. "It's human." Trace nodded, and with that simple gesture, he accepted everything she was. That night, while the crickets sang like the world belonged to them, Rhea brought out a piece of leather she had sewn with her own hands. She laid it on the table in front of Trace. "It's not a gift," she said. "It's a reminder." He looked at it. It was a kind of small blanket, decorated with patterns made from dyed thread and baked clay beads. "What does it represent?" he asked. "The place where I stood back up, without anyone asking me to fall again." Trace lowered his gaze, touched the stitched edges with care. "Then I'll keep it, the way you keep things you don't deserve, but you're grateful for." She didn't reply, but she placed her hand on his shoulder, and that gesture said more than 1,000 words ever could. The days that followed were quiet, not perfect, but real enough to stay. One day Rhea fixed a broken chair. Another, she mapped out a new route to carry water to the garden. Trace built a small winter shelter using lumber that had been forgotten for years in the storage shed. None of it was romantic or heroic, but in every action, there was an unspoken promise. "I'm here. No conditions." One morning, as they walked a fence line together, Rhea stopped and said, "Do you think what we have, needs a name?" Trace thought it over. Chewed on the question the way you chew hard bread at dawn. "I don't know," he said. "But if one day someone asks what we were, I'd like to say, we were what you choose every single day without being told to." Rhea looked at him with calm eyes, but steady. "Then, that's what we are." That afternoon, as they worked on the same old post, Trace hammered in an extra nail. It wasn't necessary. The wood was already firm. Rhea noticed. "That one was extra." "No, that one's for whoever leans here someday." She lowered her eyes, smiled, not because of the joke, but because of what went unsaid. Because in that nail, in that small, clumsy gesture, there was a home. Winter came without warning. One morning, the valley woke covered in frost. The wood creaked, the horses snorted louder, and breath came out in thick, short clouds. The river slowed, and even the wind seemed to move with caution. Trace Morvan was up before sunrise, same as always. He lit the fire, warmed some coffee, and sat on the edge of the bed with his elbows resting on his knees. Outside, the world waited. Inside, he was no longer alone. Rhea Redfeather was still sleeping, wrapped in the heavy blanket she had sewn herself out of scraps of leather and wool. Her breathing was calm, her body strong, her presence quiet but steady, like the land itself. Trace looked at her for a moment. Not like a man looking at something he loves, but like a man thankful for something that stayed without ever being asked. There were no miracles. No one came to validate their choice. No applause, no wedding, no big words. There were only days of shared work, of cold fought off with firewood and easy silences, of small tasks that quietly said, "I'm here," of trust built without questions, of glances that spoke what lips no longer knew how to explain. One midday, while fixing a frozen water channel, Trace set down the shovel and said, "Never pictured this." Rhea looked over without stopping her work. "This what?" "Not feeling like I'm waiting for something to break." She smiled slightly. "Because everything already broke before. And still, we're here." He nodded. "Yeah." The cabin had 2 solid chairs now, not just one. But not as a symbol, not as a romantic gesture, just because they were needed. One for him, one for her, and sometimes a third one, put together on the spot, for whoever came by with a story or news from town. There was no talk of the future, nor of the past, only of the next market day, of whether the rain might come, of whether the planted grain could survive the frost, of whether the corral needed another post. Small things, real things. Trace never brought up Creed Voss again. And Rhea never asked. They both knew that not all the dead are buried in the ground. Sometimes they're buried in actions, in choices, in staying, when it would have been easier to leave. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Rhea said, "I used to think a safe place was where no one could get in." Trace handed her a cup of coffee. "And now?" "Now, I know a safe place is where you don't need to run if someone does." He sat with that for a moment, and after a few seconds he said, "Then I reckon we're doing all right." She looked at him and said nothing more, because not everything needed saying anymore. The snow came for the first time that night. Quiet, soft. It wrapped around the cabin, blanketed the rooftops, slipped through the cracks like a visitor who didn't ask permission. Trace stepped out onto the porch with a blanket over his shoulders. Rhea followed, arms crossed. Neither of them spoke. They just watched the land turn white, but not empty. And as the cold wind whistled through the bare trees, she stepped closer to him, not for warmth, but because she chose to. He wrapped his arm around her, not out of duty, but as an answer. And so, with no promises and no written endings, they remained. Not as those who had conquered, but as the ones who stayed when no one else did. And you? Do you believe staying is an act of courage, or just a slower way of giving up? If this story moved you, we invite you to join us in discovering more true tales from the Old West. Stories that honor resilience, tenderness, and the spirit God placed in those who carved a path through untamed lands. Subscribe, share. Leave your thoughts in the comments, and ride with us once more across this wild country. Thank you.